So let's talk about nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is kind of an interesting example because our air that we breathe is mostly nitrogen. So the largest amount, the gas that's most present in the air that you breathe is nitrogen. However, even though nitrogen is critical for life, we are not able to take in nitrogen from the air and use it and put it in our amino acids, into the proteins in our body. So what we use are bacteria, and bacteria convert nitrogen from atmospheric nitrogen to a form that plants can use, for example, so ammonium or nitrate. Plants take up that nitrate that bacteria convert for them, so this is called nitrogen fixing. We can think of it as bacteria fixing the nitrogen from the atmosphere, fixing it to other molecules and giving it to the plants so that the plants can take them up, and the plants will incorporate that nitrate into their proteins, into their amino acids, and then we can get that source of nitrogen from the plants. So that's how the nitrogen cycles throughout the living organisms on Earth. So it goes from the atmosphere to bacteria to and there's different kinds of bacteria that perform different functions. We're not going to focus on them, but just remember that bacteria do fix the nitrogen and allow primary producers to take it up, and then we can get, human beings can get nitrogen from those organic sources. So here are a few slides just summarizing that nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen is very important for proteins. The main reservoir is in the atmosphere. But this nitrogen must be converted to ammonium or nitrate for uptake by plants, and this happens through nitrogen fixation. A lot of the times when we have a field, let's say, that's growing plants, we water it and we make sure the field has sunshine and all of those nice things that fields need. And the other thing that plants need are nutrients. So when we grow something in a field and then cut it all down and then try to grow something again and do that over and over again, over time what happens is those nutrients are sapped out of the ground. So because we keep cutting down all the plants and giving them to people to eat and then growing more plants, we're really removing nutrients from the ground at a very high rate, and over time that soil is not going to have the nutrients that the plants need to survive anymore. So at this point, there's going to be a nutrient that's limiting to whatever agricultural endeavor you are looking at. Typically, when this happens, it's either nitrogen or phosphorus that's limiting from the ground, and because of this, people will start adding nitrogen artificially to their agriculture to try to compensate for this mineral deficiency and to try to grow plants that will grow big and strong and will not look like a nutrient deficient plant. So some experimentalists went to Long Island to study what the limiting nutrient was for phytoplankton, for example, and if you are a budding ecologist, this will be your life. You'll be able to go to the Long Island Sound. That looks kind of like Fire Island, actually, where I've spent some of my childhood camping. So you'll be able to go to Long Island Sound and set up experimental systems where you're going to have something growing in the ocean, and somehow you're going to create some kind of barriers, and you're going to start adding different nutrients, and you're going to have a control, right? Because controls are very important, and you're going to see what happens when you don't add any nutrients, and then you're going to add, let's say, phosphate. And the phosphate, which is in green there, the green bars didn't grow much better than the control. So I guess adding phosphate didn't really help. However, when you add ammonium, and ammonium is basically just a different form of nitrogen, all of a sudden the phytoplankton grew just sprung up, and there was a huge abundance of phytoplankton. So from that we can conclude that nitrogen, in the form of ammonia here, but nitrogen was a limiting nutrient in that system. So without that nutrient, that the plants were growing kind of slowly. We added it into the system and now they just exploded and grew very rapidly. So because nitrogen is usually the limiting nutrient, human beings like to add nitrogen back to their agricultural crops. However, because they're just basically pouring ammonium or nitrate in a liquid form, they can completely oversaturate the system and add way too much nitrate, and the excess will run off into, when you water the field, the excess will run off with the water. So this has a big impact on the local ecosystems that are around that agricultural field, and will have a huge impact on wherever that water goes that gets taken up by, that gets washed away with the water that goes into the field. So let's take a look at how that simple action of nitrogen enriching agricultural fields has on the local ecosystem. So let's take a look at the disturbance that humans have introduced just by fertilizing their fields. Okay, so this is basically what I just mentioned. So fertilization replaces those nutrients that could be limiting and the nutrients that have been lost from the soil. So commercial fertilizers are enriched in nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And again, those are just usually in liquid form. So you're basically just taking a liquid form of nitrate and just dumping it on the field. If you use an organic fertilizer, so not a fertilizer, that's basically just a liquid, you're actually adding organic material to your field, and in this way the nitrogen is going to break down slowly from the organic material and slowly go into the roots of your plants, where your roots can take them up after it's been fixed by bacteria if it needs to be. So in this case, when you use organic fertilizers, you don't have as much nitrogen runoff, if any, from the field. So when it rains, you're not going to wash away a huge amount of nitrogen all at once, because the nitrogen is still part of that organic material and it's going to decompose slowly around the vicinity of your roots and feed your plants kind of slowly. Okay, so here's a nice picture of a field that's growing very well because possibly it's been fertilized. I believe those are corn. So what happens when that nitrogen, when it rains, and all of that loose nitrate that's not attached to anything, it's not part of any organic material, is going to wash away. And we haven't talked much about water cycles yet, but we will. So when rain washes away nitrogen from a field, it's going to go into the next body of water that is downstream of it, and it's going to dump a whole bunch of nitrate into that body of water where most likely there's a lot of living organisms living. So what happens is that nitrogen doesn't just fertilize the plants in your field, it also fertilizes phytoplankton, which are photosynthetic plankton, right? Tiny little plants, and or algae, right? Another plant, anything green that takes up sunlight and converts it to matter, right? Anything that can photosynthesize is going to take that nitrogen and it's going to take off, just like that experiment that we saw on Long Island. Anything that takes up the nitrogen is going to grow very rapidly. So when that happens, we can see these huge blooms of algae, for example. So here they're showing you a picture of an algal bloom where a lot of nitrogen runoff from an agricultural field has caused a huge amount of algae to grow. So what happens when we get these algal blooms is it can be quite detrimental to the local ecosystem, because the algae will grow on top of the water and kind of like on the very top, because they need sunlight, right? So they're growing on the top of that body of water, and so you might think, well, plants growing is great, right? We know that plants take CO2 from the atmosphere and then release oxygen, so what's wrong with a lot of plants releasing oxygen in the water? Well, what happens is that slightly below the bloom site, below, so it blocks out the sunlight from anything that's underneath it, so that's one problem that arises. The other thing is that once the algae kind of springs up and blooms, and then a lot of it grows, and then usually it dies down at some point. So once it dies, all of that material that's on top of the water is going to sink down and decompose. And the bacteria come and start having a feast, start having a field day of all the algae that fell to the bottom of that body of water. And bacteria are not photosynthetic, so bacteria actually use oxygen. So they're going to use all of the oxygen in the water in that area, and what happens is you get parts of the water, large areas of water that have basically no oxygen in them. And if a fish is in the area, the fish might be able to swim away, but anything that's sedentary is not going to be able to swim away, so they're going to die from anoxia. And we can see a huge amount of this happening in the Gulf of Mexico. So here's a picture showing you, excuse me, let's read the caption. So it's a picture showing you, it's a color photo of a large bloom of phytoplankton. So there's been a lot of nutrient runoff, and the phytoplankton, so in the summer everything gets watered, and a lot of agriculture happens in the spring, right? So everything gets fertilized in the spring. So in the summer there's a huge bloom of phytoplankton, and it comes from the Mississippi River, so we know where it comes from, and it dumps into the Gulf of Mexico. And you can see hopefully from the map that it's a pretty large area. So what happens next is you have a huge bloom of these phytoplankton. When the blooms die at the end of the season and sink to the bottom, the bacterial decomposition strips the oxygen from the surrounding water, creates an environment that is very difficult for marine life to survive in, and so a lot of the local fish die. And if you read up about this dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, you can read about how difficult it's been to prevent and take care of, and what a terrible impact it's had locally. Okay, so that is the Gulf of Mexico dead zone, and here's just a picture of how that happens. So as we said previously, we have that huge bloom of phytoplankton. It grows. When it dies, it falls to the bottom, and the bacteria decompose it and will use up all the oxygen locally. And the water is going to not have any oxygen in it anymore. So the process of these large nutrient supplies happening all at once, and then everything blooming and then dying, and the oxygen being removed or reduced in the water, is called eutrophication. And it can happen naturally as well, but humans have definitely contributed pretty significantly to it happening much more frequently and in much higher levels. So let's talk a little bit about nitrogen fixation. And we did mention this previously, and nitrogen fixation is the process of bacteria taking nitrogen from the atmosphere and converting it into a form that plants can take up, and plants will then use that nitrogen and incorporate it into their organic matter, and then we will come along and eat those plants, and that's our source of nitrogen. So we can only get nitrogen from organic material. Okay, so plants and soil microbes have a mutualistic relationship. So do you remember what mutualistic is? Symbiotic, right? So we benefit off each other, and the bacteria are going to fix the nitrogen for the plants, and the plants in turn will support the microbes as well. So they give them food and sugar and other elements that make their environment good and nice to live in. And here's just a picture of all the a fake picture of all the microbes living in the vicinity of roots in plants, and that whole tiny ecosystem is known as the ribosphere. So all of the microbes that live in the proximity of the roots and are contributing to them. So around the area around the roots has a lot of sugars and amino acids, which are part of proteins, and other things that roots secrete that microbes love to live around. But let's learn a little bit about the nitrogen cycle that happens locally in the ground. So nitrogen, like we said, is a very important limiting nutrient for plants, and most of the nitrogen that we encounter is going to be in the air. So the air has a lot of nitrogen, and it's in the form of N2, right? Just two nitrogen atoms combined together. And plants need to take up nitrogen in the form of nitrate. So let's look at how bacteria convert N2 to nitrate and allow plants to take them up. Okay, so here's a nice cartoon of that. So we're looking around the root, and we know that a lot of bacteria live around the root. So here's N2 in the atmosphere. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria will take up that N2, and they'll have their own internal chemical processes, and they'll convert that N2 to first ammonia and then nitrate eventually. And then that nitrate can go into the root system of the plant, and plants will take up those roots, and then they'll convert that nitrate to organic material. So they'll put it into their proteins. So again, we're seeing how a element such as nitrogen can start as part of your breathing air, and then will turn into something that goes into your plant. So it's the same atom that's just being converted into a different. It's being part of a different system. So now that nitrogen is part of the proteins in the plant, for example. Nitrogen fixation, right, is the process of converting that atmospheric N2 to NH3, which is ammonium, and then usually eventually to nitrate as well. And this happens through a symbiotic relationship that plants have with the bacteria that live around their roots. So we know now that the process of fertilizing or agriculture can, while it gives the plants a large amount of that limiting nutrient, nitrogen, it can also have a really detrimental effect on the ecosystem by putting too much nitrogen in the ecosystem, and you get flare-ups of algae and other green plants growing in other forms in places that you don't want them to be growing. So let's think about another way that we can add back nitrogen to our agriculture in a more sustainable way. So one way people have figured out how to do actually a long time ago was through crop rotation. And what people figured out is that there are some plants actually, such as legumes or peanuts, that will actually their roots have the microbes that fix nitrogen in them already. And so you plant those legumes or those peanuts in the ground, and all of they're going to grow a ton of bacteria around their roots that are going to convert a lot of atmospheric nitrogen to ammonium and nitrate, and that's going to be in the soil. So the plants are going to take some of it up, but the soil itself is going to become enriched in nitrate. And then the next year, you can either harvest all those plants, or you could just crush them up and put them back in the earth and let them compost. The next year, you're going to have soil that's really full of organic, nice nitrogen sources, and also nitrate sources from the nitrogen fixing from the bacteria that are going to naturally fertilize your field the next year, the next time you plant something that's not necessarily a legume or a peanut. So this is one way that you can add nitrogen back to your field, to your agricultural source, and have it be in a sustainable way. And as with most things, if we look at our sources of food, we know that the amount of nitrogen it takes to produce certain types of food, such as livestock or eggs or chickens. Well, I guess here they're looking at mostly living sources of food. That the smaller, so chickens and eggs, for example, have a much higher nitrogen efficiency than cattle, which take a lot of food, right? We know that that they're fairly inefficient at converting all of the grass they eat to mass, and therefore they have a much larger nitrogen footprint. So eating of the cattle is contributing a lot more nitrogen waste to all of that nitrogen pollution that we talked about.